Right, continuing on with consumption and materialism, we are going to explore consumption and environmental action here at this point. And so, the key point is it's all, once again, kind of intense and can be very depressing, but we can make good choices. You know, the problem, the flip side of that is that those good choices often cost more, as we all know. And so that makes it difficult to decide how to expend the finite dollars that one has, because even though those more environmentally sound products or food, whatever, cost more, they don't really, because we're not, the cost, even for the better stuff, doesn't really reflect the total environmental cost. So think about the real costs of, what the plastics, for instance, just plastic is doing, you know, to the oceans, those huge plastic lagoons floating out there in the oceans, and to the world at large. That's just one thing. That's just plastics. Okay, and then you think about insecticides and herbicides on food. So the real cost is much greater. But I do understand, and this is part of the issue, and we'll discuss it more in the next chapter, that it isn't, it's easy to say, well, just buy green, and that's a bit more difficult. But I did make a decision about that for years, teaching about this stuff, because it comes up. The environment is always a chapter in sociology and anthropology textbooks too. So in all the classes I teach, this subject comes up. And, finally I realized I can't keep driving my old Volvo station wagon that I just adore that gets, 22 miles to the gallon or 20 miles to the gallon or something. And so I wound up biting the bullet, and I couldn't afford a new Prius. I couldn't, this was years ago. But I did buy a used one, and it took a lot of research and that type of thing. But I feel better. I feel less, I feel more authentic about what I teach if I walk my talk a bit. So I think for all of us that there's also non-material payoffs in these trade-offs about how we feel about ourselves and authenticity and what we care about and that type of thing. So there are ways to do it. And so let's now look at goods and community and how individualism has weakened the ties of social ecology and community power. So we feel the lack of those ties unconsciously, even if not consciously. They're missing. I just read an article about the new thing, which is not late teen suicide, but child suicide in America now, in the New Yorker. And it's just shocking. And as you read it, you go through all of these things about what could be going on, and scientists and psychologists and medical doctors and meds and blah blah blah, on and on and on, trying to figure it out. And no one is so far really mentioning this idea of social ties and community, and having time of families to be together and do things, having time for parents to be able to attend to what's going on with their kids. And you'll see, once again, when you look at France, and you can, you should also Google maternity and paternity leave in Sweden, for example. I may put that up in a different class if it's in a different week if it's appropriate. But those are policies that build in more structure for social ties. And so that's, as I said, whether we're aware of what's going on or not, or how it affects us, it does. So what happens is we try and buy community in some way or the other. you know, for ourselves or for others. Um, Also, those T-shirts with logos we talked about. This It's great. I'm not putting down T-shirts with logo or logos. I kind of am, but sayings that say what you mean. That type of thing. Uh, but that's a way to buy community, right? And so we gain status. We've talked about this previously, uh, in community through the goods we display, and it tells people who we are. They tell people who we are. And therefore, goods become a substitute for social needs in many, 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 many ways. So, if your kid is depressed and suicidal children is just almost more to even you can even bear to think about, buying them a new smartphone or a widget or a widget, or if it's a tiny kid, a fuzzy toy, is not going to satisfy community needs. It's not going to satisfy the social ties that are lacking. So what's the paradox here? The paradox is that we're using individualistic methods like shopping to solve the lack of community, and that further recedes social ties. It's another negative feedback loop, right? So it becomes a vicious cycle. The more we lose community, the more we seek to find it through goods, and the more we seek to the wealth. But how do you get the goods? You need the money. So the more you seek the wealth to attain the goods, or the money to attain the goods, the more you become involved in the modern economy, which is work, 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 nose to the grindstone, often at horrible jobs that have no community within them either. You're in a little cell or you're on the phone all day, you know. And that economy is undermining the community and the environment. So it's just this vicious cycle, which results in what's called the time crunch, which I'm sure many of you are very, very well aware of. And so part of the problem is that simple lack of time. And that's why I think, once again, that the clip on the French system is going to just really, I've seen it 100 times showing it in classes, and I get so sad and moved every time I see it, because it's like, why can't we do that? Why can't we have 5, 6 weeks paid vacation for everybody? They pay you to when you move, they pay you time off when you move, when you get married, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see when you watch it. It's only, I think, 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes long. So we know what the time crunch is. I'm sure those of you who are particularly working and going to school and parenting, et cetera, really know what the time crunch is. We work more hours by far than any other industrialized nation, and that's increased over the years. It still is increasing. So once again, there's no time, right, for the things. So if you look at the figure 3.2 in your book, the mandatory paid vacation by country, you'll see. And the United States is down there at the very, 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 very bottom. Okay. I'm not going to tell you everything France does, although I've started to telling you a bit about it, and Scandinavian countries as well. And, to a much greater extent than the US, the rest of Europe also does this. But in France, for example, it's illegal to call somebody when they're on vacation from your place of employment. It's illegal. It's against the law. If someone's sunbathing in, someplace on vacation and work needs you, forget it. It's your vacation. Can you imagine that? Because I've been reading, again, articles about people who spend their whole vacation on their cell phones with work, or Zooming or whatever. I just learned this fact the other night from watching something. In Germany, you can't keep workers out of natural light for more than 4 hours at a time. It's a law. Workers in office buildings and other places must have access to be able to go outside and be in natural light, and I don't know for how long, but they need to have access to it after 4 hours of working in a building. Okay, so you can just imagine. And then the social effects of the time crunch is also There's a chart in the chapter. But consumption, here's some of the good news. Consumption can also build community. I'm sure those gatherings you have with families for birthday parties and various other gift exchanges, Christmas, they have Christmas listed. Christmas is problematic in America, as you know, because it's all about money, 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 and buying a ton of stuff that's usually not. I was reading, where did I learn this? About 40% of Christmas presents are returned. So they're obviously not deeply meaningful to anybody, or that wouldn't happen. So, but the idea of the gatherings and the gift exchange is very powerful and can build community. The potlatch of the Native peoples of the Pacific Northwest is another example. At some point, I'll put up a film about the potlatch for you. But the idea is the potlatch chief, the chief is Western terminology, leader, accumulates wealth over a long period of time, can be a year or more. Only the whole idea is to throw this huge party, the potlatch, and give it all away, to redistribute the wealth. Okay. So we talked about the time crunch and a variety of other things, and what this all leads to is what's called the treadmill of consumption. That your level of wealth has very little to do, actually, the research shows, with your happiness. Now, the caveat is there here is that it's beyond a certain minimum, right? As long as your real basic needs are met, you're not starving, you're not freezing, you're not homeless, as an example. Those folks are not, as you know, I wouldn't say that their happiness level is the equivalent of other people's that are not homeless, but you get the point. If your kind of your basic needs are met, then beyond a certain minimum, then your happiness levels don't change that much. And this, the film Affluenza describes this as well. So according to research, the wealthy are only slightly more satisfied with their standard of living than others. And that's called the Easterlin paradox, because Easterlin was the person who did the research. And the paradox is, well, the more money you have, the happier you should be, the more stuff you have. But no, it turns out that when you do the research, that's not true. When you ask people, they're only slightly happier. And interestingly, Colombia, of all places, is the second happiest country, but it's the 62nd poorest country. The wealthiest, of course, do tend to be among the happiest, but that wealth does not necessarily lead to more satisfaction, right? Check out the Bhutan video. Okay, that's the happiest nation on earth. They don't have gross domestic product or gross national index. They have gross domestic happiness is gross national happiness. And you'll see that. And so they're a very poor country by our standards, certainly, but they're the happiest, okay? Hong Kong, it's the wealthiest country in the world, but it's the fifth wealthiest country, but it's the 52nd in happiness, tied with, get this, for happiness, not wealth, South Africa, Iran, Kazakhstan, and Jordan. Now, the U.S. is number one in wealth, but we're only as happy as Guatemala, which is the 33rd poorest country in the study. In 1957 was when the U.S. apparently population was the happiest, and it peaked then at about 53%, and it's never gotten back to that level since then. In 2014, only 33% of the adults in America say they're very happy. So here's another thing to think about, just to leave you with, as the text does, to think about the social consequences of disasters, for example. They're horrible. Agreed. We're talking here more about natural disasters than about the horrors that are happening in Ukraine right now. But your house burns down, a hurricane comes along, and often, and it's too bad it has to happen that way for people to do this, people rediscover social ties. They help each other. They remember, put back together what is really important in life, which is other people and the fact and your family and caring, being able to contribute, those types of things. So as I said, it's too bad that often a crisis is what reminds us of those things. Let's start trying to remember them ahead of a crisis, and maybe we can avert some of the crises. As your book points out, not only do we consume more than we need, but we consume more than we actually want. We just don't know it. We just don't understand that what we want is something else that we're trying to satisfy with the consumption of material things. Right. Thanks for being around. That's the end of chapter 3, and we'll move on to chapter 4.